sometimes you just need to remind yourself to keep your eye on the bigger picture. Hello there, folks. It is time for my monthly dive into LGBTQ plus representation topics, which means that, first of all, we can switch the look. Okay. So, a reminder of my dog in this particular race. I have a fluid sense of gender that usually lumps me in with the Q in LGBTQ plus under queer, which kind of serves as the catch-all in a lot of cases. That and the plus, I guess. I tend to just go with queer. It works well. So, I'm going to talk about something that I run into, actually not even restricted to LGBTQ plus representation. I see it in other places too, but I'm going to filter this through this discussion and this topic as a way to sort of illustrate how this sort of thing is a problem. And that is how people, as a society, as viewers, as consumers of media, we have a tendency to defend instances but ignore patterns. And by that, what I mean, when you talk about LGBTQ plus representation, and if someone, whether they are LGBTQ plus themselves or not, brings up something as being problematic, unless that thing, that element of an LGBTQ plus representation is a flat out lie, is just negative propaganda, is just hateful, unless that's the case, and that's the case increasingly less, at least in most mainstream media, then you frequently have people defending the thing that is being labeled as problematic because they will break apart. Well, no, it's okay because, and they'll put it in the context of the specific use and basically saying, what's wrong with that? Well, nothing, unless there's a pattern of it. So I kind of just laid it out in generalities. Let me get a little more specific. And I'm actually going to narrow this way down because what I'm talking about here, as I said, this is something that expands even beyond LGBTQ plus representation, and obviously that entire spectrum is affected by what I'm about to talk about, but I'm going to narrow it down to my own specific experience, and I'm going to talk about it specifically in terms of representations of cross-dressing in mainstream media. Now, for those of you who didn't already know, prior to getting enough of a sense of myself to start identifying as gender fluid, I identified as a cross-dresser. I didn't sort of come to a full sense of myself in terms of my internal sense of gender and the fluctuations with that for a long time. But for a long time, I simply identified as a cross-dresser, which I actually wrote a book about called Skirting Gender Life and Lessons of a Cross-Dresser. This is not just a plug. This is actually relevant because this is something that I do talk about in here, and I'm going to go into more detail now because I do talk about pop culture representations of cross-dressing in media there, but I'm going to dive a little bit deeper because in my book, I really only talked about the negative and I think kind of difficult to defend representations of men who dress as women, which, some examples that I cite in the book are things like Sorority Boys, Big Mama's House, those sorts of films, White Chicks. They do not paint a, let's go with helpful picture of men who dress as women. Now, of course, it's not their obligation to be inclusive, and I understand what they're doing and all that, but I mean, those also aren't examples that a lot of people will necessarily defend. They'll either say it's a joke, get over it, or they won't touch it. But I actually had a conversation a few days ago, as of the time of this recording, with my partner about instances of cross-dressing being depicted in media where it's not as inherently problematic in the instances. So some of the specific ones we talked about are things like Some Like It Hot, Mrs. Doubtfire, Tootsie. Now, these are films that I do not find offensive in their depiction of men dressing as women. I actually enjoy those films. I enjoy all three of those films to varying degrees. Even Some Like It Hot, as old as it is, I don't think is particularly problematic in its depiction and way of handling the comedy inherent with men dressing as women. But I've sort of already started to touch on part of the thing there. Because those three films, again, I feel good films, and the three I already mentioned, which I don't think are very good films, even, cross-dressing issues aside, they are all comedies. And generally speaking, when men in mainstream entertainment were depicted as dressing as females, there were two consistencies in pretty much every depiction. It was played for comedy, and they weren't doing it by choice. Something was forcing their hand. There were circumstances that gave them limited choices that they decided to do this. And that's true of all of these films that I've already mentioned. You've got, with things like White Chicks and Big Mama's House, you have a need to go undercover. With something like Sorority Boys, it's wishing to be in sorority fraternity culture, but they got kicked out of a frat, so they pretend to be women to be in a sorority. Some Like It Hot, they're hiding out from the mob. Mrs. Doubtfire, he's doing it to see his kids. Tootsie, it's an actor who has just kind of wrecked his career, and he figures the only way he could ever get work is if he is not perceived to be who he is, and he goes with presenting as a woman. Now, some of these instances, looking at them specifically, individually, are absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with them. But where it becomes a problem is when the predominant, if not exclusive, representation of cross-dressing is men forced into it by circumstance and played for comedy. Because what that does is it creates a general culture where a man being in a dress is a source of laughter and something to be mocked, and where you create a perspective that no self-respecting man would ever choose to do this, because the only depictions are ones who have in some way been forced into doing this. No man would actually choose to do this. And that pattern and the pervasiveness of it, and at the exclusion of having depictions in pop culture media of men choosing to dress as women and it not being either comedic or something that they are in some way forced to do, are few and far between. They're not non-existent, but they are by far the minority. And so the problem isn't each individual instance. The problem is the pattern that it forms. And that is the thing that I think gets lost sometimes when we get into debates about what is or isn't problematic depiction of various members of the LGBTQ plus community. Because we can often get hung up zeroing in on a specific instance and go, no, but it's okay here because of this, or it's fine in this context. But like, it doesn't matter if it's fine in that context. When the real damage is big picture. When the real damage is, well, no, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's the only version of that that exists. So this was part of the issue I had in what I consider to sort of be the gay explosion of the early 2000s, when things like Will and Grace Was Big and Queer as Folk came out, and Bravo as a channel headed in that direction, and all of those sorts of things happened. Was, yes, there was a very higher degree of visibility for gay men, but it was a pretty stock representation. And seeing more of them was a good thing. But the vast majority of them were depicted as flamboyant, effeminate, basically fabulous. And when that's all that's out there, it creates an illusion of a singular version of something. And it fails to acknowledge that that's not the only flavor that gay men or anybody comes in. And, to bring it back to cross-dressing specifically, it was one of the things that confused me a lot and threw me off a lot when in my younger years, trying to get a sense of myself, because I didn't have a representation to cling to. Because I could see films, TV, what have you, that depicted men in dresses, but it wasn't anything for me to take solace in. It wasn't anything for me to take guidance from. And again, each individual instance is not obligated to be a positive role model or representation, but when every instance is effectively the same thing, that pattern and the sense of what someone is that creates, that is a problem. And this is also actually kind of an element in something that I've talked about before, which is the issue of whether or not only trans actors should be playing trans roles. Something that I haven't gone into specific detail, I'm not sure is enough to fill out its own video, so I'll touch on it here. One of the things that is often very frustrating for me when cis actors are cast to play trans characters, the vast majority of the time, not always, but the vast majority of instances, they cast someone who the gender of the actor, of the cis actor, is the gender that the trans character transitioned out of, as opposed to the one they transitioned into. In other words, generally when a cis actor is playing a trans man, they cast a cis woman. Generally when an actor is playing a trans woman, they cast a cis man. Or at least historically that's been the case. Hopefully things will start getting better. And this actually will come out a few months from when I record it, so I mean, who knows? Not that I expect massive upheaval in a few months. That would be a little optimistic of me. But my point is that pattern of casting, beyond the issues I already talked about with casting cis actors in trans roles anyways, which, I mean, you can check out my earlier video on that, but that practice of casting the gender, of casting actors who were the gender that the characters transitioned out of, that created its own problematic pattern because it reinforces the idea that trans people ultimately are still whatever gender they started out as, and they're just pretending, which is part of the narrative frequently used to oppress trans people. You know, that trans women aren't women. That's just a man in a dress. And when you cast a cis man to play a trans woman, it reinforces that because we know that the actor is just a man in a dress. So, and again, specific instances can be defended, but it is the pattern. It is the pattern that matters. And I also want to be clear, I don't think I'm not conspiratorial by nature. I talk about how these casting choices or these depiction choices with cross-dressers or what have you cause a problem and lend credence towards things used to oppress and undermine certain minority populations. I do not believe that to be intentional. I don't believe there's some grand conspiracy of Hollywood where they're carefully monitoring, how they're going to cast these things to be sure that the pop culture feels about LGBTQ plus people in a certain way. I don't believe that. But I do believe that people will just fall back on they fall back on cliche and stereotypes. And that's an element of these things, of these patterns, is stereotypes are easier to deal with than fleshed out nuance. So while I do not believe there is any particular malice in any of these instances, and as I said, many of them can still be very fine films, it's the pattern, it's the repeat. And as I said, this isn't even limited to LGBTQ+. I remember on my video that I did a while back about 5 things Doctor Who needs to stop doing, one of the things I talked about was that they needed to stop bringing back companions after they left, because every single companion, as of this recording, Series 11 hasn't started yet, but every single companion, main primary companion, has reappeared after their supposed exit from the show. Every single one of them has. Now, people got uppity with me about that, specifically like they were going, well, the one with Amy shouldn't count because she didn't come back. That was just a vision he had of him. And I kept finding myself commenting like, it's not about whether or not every instance was literally bringing a character back from the dead. It's about the fact that it happens every single time. It's the pattern that needs to be broken. It's not a question of whether it makes sense in any one instance. And unfortunately, that is an argument that can be made either in good faith or in bad faith. Someone can defend a specific instance because they genuinely feel that there is nothing wrong with it, or they can defend a specific instance because they understand that making that argument and picking apart one specific part of what is a much bigger argument is a way to undermine what somebody is saying. So, unfortunately, those sorts of defenses of the instances within these patterns, like I said, they could be made in good faith or bad faith. And a bad faith argument is an argument being made by someone who is not actually trying to debate you, but instead simply trying to trap you, trying to undermine you, and actually doesn't have a goal besides that. They're not trying to have a conversation, they just want to undercut. It's not about how strong every single one is. It's about the picture, and it's about the strength of all of it together. Because if you want to look at a brick wall, you could probably find imperfections and issues in every single brick if you wanted to. Oh, that one's got a crack, that one's got a dent, that one's got a hole, the grout's a little loose there. That's still a brick wall. Good luck pushing it down. Even though you can bring issue with every single individual piece of it, the strength of it is in everything assembled together. The power is in the pattern, or in the case of problematic representation, the problem is in the pattern. So I think I'll wrap up on that note. I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that because I find it helpful for me. I don't know if other people find it helpful. I find it helpful for me to come to a better understanding of the terms and the ideas and the concepts that I tend to talk about in these videos. Because like I said, I had a conversation with my partner, and she doesn't play devil's advocate, but she does have a tendency to push people for more details on their stances so that she can understand them better, and occasionally to see if they have actually sort of thought through what they're saying to the degree that they seem to have the confidence of. And I love that she does that. I greatly appreciate that she does that. So I forget sometimes that things that, because I have been thinking about them for so long, they're obvious to me. Things like, it's not the individual instances, it's the pattern. That's something that's been in my head for years. And I forget that people don't think about things in the same way that I do, much less to the degree and to the extent and as frequently as I do. And that's not a criticism. Nobody's a bad person or, a bad ally or whatever because they don't think about this stuff as much as I do. But sometimes I need to step out of myself and realize, I should probably have something on the record establishing what I mean when I say X. And I think this video is kind of just one step in me trying to do that, because ultimately I think a big part of the difficulty in these conversations is we don't have agreed upon language, and we don't always have agreed upon terms with which to have the debate. So I like to be as clear as possible about the terms that I use and why I use them and what I mean by my use of them, in case what you think I mean when I say something is different from what I actually mean. Which is also part of why these videos are almost never under 15 minutes, and most of them are between 20 to 30, because I will over-explain and over-analyze, not because I wish to lecture, but because I want people to understand what it is that I'm saying. And I like to think that at the end of the day, even if you ultimately come to the conclusion that you don't agree with what I'm saying, if you can understand why it is that I'm saying it and the thought process I have behind it, that maybe if nothing else, we can come to a greater level of respect for each other's views and opinions, because I can demonstrate that I'm not just banging an ethos drum. These thoughts, these ideas, they come from places, and they come from, there is a thought process. I try very hard to not just parrot stuff that I've heard. And I'm not perfect, I'm sure, especially if you go back to before I had the sort of the same attention to detail on these things that I tend to have now. I just probably instances where I said something that I probably didn't put enough thought into or look into well enough before I said it. But I try and be cautious about that now. And I hope that my doing so can just get people to understand me, my thoughts, and maybe even other people who are like me in some way a little bit better. So we'll stop there. Thank you very much for watching. There are a whole bunch of links down in the description, including the Patreon, plus a link to the book if you're at all interested. So I will wrap it up on that one, folks. Remember, you are beautiful, you are loved, you are valid, you are the council, and I just run the meetings. So until next time, this council is adjourned.